What's up, guys? It's Mr. Graves here to go over a review for the Unit 3 Constitution test. You guys ready for this? Let's knock it out. Alright, let's start at the beginning here. The Articles of Confederation. Remember, this was the first plan for the U.S. government. The U.S. Constitution was not first. This is right after the American Revolution. The Articles of Confederation was the first plan they come up with. And they were making this plan, so they had just got done fighting this really long, bitter, bloody war with the British from Great Britain. The Articles of Confederation as a document was really heavily influenced by their bad experience with Britain. So remember, they fought a war to get their independence from Britain because they did not like the way their government was working. They thought the government had too much power in their central government, like the King of England was a tyrant, had too much power, and he was using that power to abuse them and to violate their rights. So when they get to create their own new government now after beating the British, they're going to do the exact opposite of what the British have set up as their system of government, a strong central government. So what they did, the Founding Fathers at first, created a weak central government with very strong, really independent state governments that are almost like 13 separate little countries that were just kind of loosely connected. But while we understand where they were coming from there, creating a weak central government, there's a lot of problems with that. It created a lot of weaknesses for the federal government. The problem was they made the federal government too weak. So here are some examples. There was no chief executive. There really was no executive branch. No executive branch, no judicial branch, no national courts, no chief executive. A chief executive would be like the president, the leader of the executive branch. The federal government couldn't tax, which means they couldn't raise money. If you can't raise money, then you can't pay for things like a military to defend your country. You can't build roads and bridges, things like that. There was no uniform currency. Currency is like the money that you use. Like today in the United States, every state uses the same kind of money. We have the same dollar system that we use. Back then, each state had their own type of currency, which made it really hard to trade between states. And there was only one branch. The only branch they had was the legislative branch. So there were some really serious weaknesses with the federal government under the Articles of Confederation. And the Founding Fathers realized that they weren't going to work all that well. The Founding Fathers realized that there were a lot of weaknesses, so they just had to change something up. The country wouldn't last very long. So they created a new constitution, which would be the second plan for the government of the United States. But it wasn't that easy. It was hard for them to create this new constitution because the delegates from the different states had different ideas. People from Georgia had different desires, different ideas than the people from up north in, like, let's say, New York. So they had to compromise in order to create the Constitution and create the new United States. A couple of the big compromises are right here on this page. You had the Great Compromise, which was a solution to the issue of representation in Congress. What they decided to do was create a bicameral legislature, two houses with a Senate and a House of Representatives. The small states wanted equal representation in Congress as they were small. The big states wanted to have more votes and more representatives in Congress as they had more people. So to make them both happy, they give each of them their own house. The Senate is equal representation to make the small states happy. House of Representatives is based on your population. It makes the large states happy. So it's a bicameral legislature. But there was another compromise they had to make, the Three-Fifths Compromise. Well, now that we have a bicameral legislature, we know in the House of Representatives, the number of representatives each state gets is based on how many people live in your state. Well, the southern states wanted to count the slaves as part of their population, so they would get more representatives in the House of Representatives, which means they could have more votes in the new government. Well, the northern states, since they don't have as many slaves as they have in the South, are against this idea. So there's a huge debate, and they're really angry about it. So they come up with a compromise. They say, okay, the South gets to count their slaves, but they don't get to count them as a full person. They can only count them as 3/5 of a person. A little bit of a compromise. They also had another compromise called the Slave Trade Compromise. So slavery was a big issue that they couldn't agree on. The South really wanted slaves. The North didn't really like slavery at all. So it was a big issue. But if they don't come to some sort of agreement on the slave trade, there's going to be no new constitution. There's not going to be any agreement. So what the Slave Trade Compromise says is that Congress can't outlaw the slave trade until 1808. The Constitution was written in 1788. So they said for 20 years, no one can touch the slave trade. But in 1808, they can relook at it and decide if they want to get rid of it or not. Now, once they write the Constitution, they've got to decide, is this actually going to be the new government? There has to be a vote. It has to be ratified before it takes over as the new government of the United States. So there are two big sides to this. There are the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were led by a guy named Alexander Hamilton. They supported the new Constitution and the idea of a strong federal government. Most of the Federalists were from the North. There were a few from the South, but most of them were from the North. And not everyone in the North was necessarily a Federalist, but a lot of them were. The Federalists wanted the rulers of the United States to be the wealthy elites. They thought those were the people who could be trusted. They also believed in the idea of an industrial economy, that the future of the economy would be in industry, manufacturing, not so much in farming. And to help get the Constitution approved and ratified, specifically in New York, they wrote something called the Federalist Papers. There were three guys, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison, who were the three Federalists who wrote 85 essays that they kind of put together in a little pamphlet called the Federalist Papers. They were really trying to convince the people of New York to ratify the Constitution, but it had the effect of convincing people around all the other states to also vote in favor of ratifying the Constitution. On the other side, you have the Anti-Federalists. Thomas Jefferson was their main leader. Here he is on the $2 bill. The Anti-Federalists opposed the new Constitution. They did not like the idea of a strong federal government, which is what the Constitution did. It created a strong federal government, a much stronger federal government than the Articles of Confederation. They wanted the state governments to stay strong, so they did not like the Constitution. Most Anti-Federalists were from the South. They were the common people, everyday average Joes. They supported an agricultural economy. They thought the economy should always be based on farming and agriculture. And if the Constitution was going to be approved, if it was going to be ratified, the Anti-Federalists demanded that a Bill of Rights be added to the Constitution, because the main thing that they didn't like about the Constitution is that it gave the federal government too much power. And they remember what happened with Great Britain. If the federal government had too much power, they thought they would use that power to violate the rights of the people. So they wanted some sort of guarantees that the rights of citizens would be protected in a Bill of Rights, which eventually was added after the Constitution was ratified, the first 10 amendments. Now, inside the Constitution, there's several principles. You have the rule of law. There's 5 of them. The rule of law means governments and people must follow laws and that no one is above the law. Federalism is the idea that you got to share. It's to keep our sharing power between different levels of government. Separation of powers is where you divide power between 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. Checks and balances is each of those 3 branches has a little bit of power of the other, so one branch doesn't become too powerful. Everyone's kind of separating and balancing the power out. And then popular sovereignty, remember, popular means people, sovereignty means rule, but it means people have the right to rule themselves. So popular sovereignty is the idea that the government gets its power from the consent of the government. Remember, consent means approval, permission. So the government has no power unless the people give them their permission to rule over them. So let's look at checks and balances a little bit here. So with checks and balances, you have the 3 branches. You have the executive branch, which is headed by the president, the judicial branch, which is led by the courts, the Supreme Court, and the legislative branch, which is the Congress, House of Representatives, and the Senate. You can see here the arrows show you that they each have some power over the other branch. The power they have over the other branch allows them to check that power of the other branch. So, for example, the president can veto congressional laws. So the Congress gets to write the laws, but before they get to write the bills. Before a bill becomes a law, it has to go to the president. He can either sign it, which means it becomes a law, or he can veto, which means he doesn't want it to become a law. So that's a power the executive branch has over the legislative branch. But if the president vetoes a bill, it doesn't mean it's dead. I do use the analogy like life support. Imagine the bill is on a breathing machine. It's on life support. It's almost dead. It's probably going to die, but there's still a chance. It could be a miracle. Because with checks and balances, the Congress has the power to override a president's veto if they get 2/3 of the members of the House and the Senate to both vote to override the veto. It will become a law even if the president vetoes it. So those are examples of checks and balances. The president gets to nominate Supreme Court justices, but Congress gets to confirm the president's appointment. So if the president picks someone to go to the Supreme Court, that's great, but if Congress doesn't vote to approve, the Senate doesn't approve that choice, the president has to pick someone else. So they each kind of keep each other in check, and it balances power out. Checks and balances. With separation of power, we just talked about this a little bit. We have the 3 branches, and each branch has one general job. The legislative branch, in general, is a little more complicated than this, but if you want to simplify it, the legislative branch gets to make the law. This is on the test, guys. I'm telling you, it's on the test. Legislative branch makes the laws. You get to write the bills and have control over that. The executive branch, once the laws are made by the legislative branch, it's the job of the executive branch to enforce the laws, to make sure people are actually following those laws on the test. And then at the end, the judicial branch comes in and they interpret the laws. That's the toughest one to understand. What that means, interpreting laws, is they look at a law once it's passed and they decide, is this law actually constitutional? Is it a legal law? They take the Constitution, they take the law, they match them together. If the law goes with the Constitution, then it's still a law. But if it violates the Constitution, sorry about the bell there, but if it violates the Constitution, then it's not going to be allowed to be a law. That law cannot be a law any longer. So legislative branch makes the laws, executive branch enforces. Remember EE, match the E with the executive to the E of enforce. Executive branch enforces the laws, the judicial branch interprets them. The judicial branch would be the courts. Now, let's take a look at the anatomy of the Constitution, the different parts of the Constitution. So it opens up with a preamble. Remember, that prefix means before. And that's the opening of the document. And really what the preamble does is it's short. It just announces the purpose. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, do establish blah, 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 blah. It announces what the purpose of the Constitution is going to be. There's a couple of important clauses. Remember, a clause is just a line or a small part of a contract or a document like the Constitution that are important that we need to know. The necessary and proper clause gives the federal government power to do things that will help them carry out their express powers. Remember, express powers are the powers that Congress has that are exactly expressed and written in the Constitution. So, for example, in the Constitution, it says that the federal government has the power to raise a military, to create a military. It doesn't say anything about a military draft. We use this analogy in class, or this example in class. But the government has used a military draft. They've drafted people into the Army. Well, the reason they're able to do that is because the necessary and proper clause says that in order to carry out those express powers, like creating a military, the federal government has the power to do whatever it takes to carry out those powers. So in order to raise a military, if it's necessary and proper to have a military draft, then the government has the power to do that. There's also the supremacy clause. Supremacy means like in charge, which one is the overall powerful one. So in the supremacy clause, the laws of the federal government are said to be the supreme law of the land. So the state governments have some power, but the federal governments also have power. So if those powers kind of conflict with each other, the example we used in class is if the state of Georgia tried to pass a law that says you can't criticize Donald Trump or you go to jail. Well, that can't be a law because the federal law already says that the First Amendment gives you freedom of speech. You can't be punished for that. So in that case, the federal law, the First Amendment, would be supreme over Georgia state law, and Georgia could not have that law. So there you go. Let's talk about federalism. This one seems to be giving you guys some trouble. Federalism is the idea, again, sharing power between the different levels of government, the federal government and the state governments. The national powers, the powers that the federal and national government has, those are called expressed powers. They are directly written in the Constitution, and they are given to the federal government. Those powers include like keeping a military, declaring war, establishing a post office, setting standards for weights and measures, like how much is your money worth. Coining money would be another one. Protecting copyrights and patent laws. Those are all express federal powers. Now, the state powers that only the states can do, the federal government can't do these things. These are called reserve powers. A reserve power is any power that's not mentioned in the Constitution. If it's not mentioned, then that is a power the states have. Like education is not mentioned in the Constitution. Establishing local governments like a county or a city government, that's not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. So those are powers the states have. Those are reserved for the states. So some examples of reserve powers for the states are establishing local governments, that's on the test. Anything to do with schools and education, state power. Regulating commerce like trade inside the state, that is a state power. Regulating trade between states, so if you cross state borders, that's actually a federal power. Licenses for like marriage, driver's licenses, things like that, those are state powers. Now, there are some powers that the federal and the state government share. These are called concurrent powers. Concurrent powers. They both do, like collecting taxes is a concurrent power. Establishing courts, there's state and federal courts. Regulating banks, borrowing money, providing for the general welfare, punishing criminals like law enforcement. Remember, there's a GBI for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. There's an FBI for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So those are concurrent powers. So there you have it, guys. Hope this really helps you review. If you have any more questions, feel free to ask me. Send me an email. Send me a remind question. I will do my very best to answer as many of those questions as I can.